Dear Dr. Pachauri, Honorable Chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Sayın Rektörüm, değerli katılımcılar, hoş geldiniz diyor, hepinizi saygıyla selamlıyorum. Öncelikle bize ev sahipliği yapan, esasen kurulduğu günden beri derneğimizin merkezini barındıran ve çalışmalarımıza hep destek olan, bugün de üniversitenin 150. yıl etkinlikleri kapsamında bu organizasyonun hayata geçmesini sağlayan Boğaziçi Üniversitesi'ne teşekkürlerimi arz etmek isterim. Sayın Hükümetler Arası İklim Değişikliği Paneli Başkanı'nın ülkemize gelmesine ana sponsorluk yapan İGDAŞ'a ve altın sponsorumuz Borusan'a da teşekkürlerimizi sunarım. Enerji Ekonomisi Derneği olarak, bildiğiniz üzere Uluslararası Enerji Ekonomisi Birliği IAEA'nin Türkiye koluyuz. Ve bugün burada IAEA'nin kurucularından, geçmiş başkanlarından birini ağırlamak bizlere ayrı bir gurur vermektedir. Sayın Pachauri 1989-90 yıllarında IAEA başkanlığı yapmıştır. Biz Enerji Ekonomisi Derneği olarak 31. IAEA Uluslararası Konferansı'nı 2008 yılında İstanbul'da gerçekleştirirken Türkiye'nin ve IAEA'nin ilk karbon nötr konferansı olarak yaptık. İklim değişikliği konularında Türkiye'de hep öncü sivil toplum kuruluşu olduk. Birleşmiş Milletler İklim Değişikliği Çerçeve Sözleşmesi Sekreteryası'na araştırma kuruluşları kategorisinde Türkiye'den akredite olan ilk STK olduk ve taraflar toplantısına düzenli temsilci gönderdik. 2011 yılındaki 17. taraflar toplantısında Türkiye'ye günün fosili ödülü verildiğinde hemen üzerine bir basın açıklaması yaptık. Türkiye'ye haksızlık yapıldığını söyledik. Ertesi yıl 18. taraflar toplantısında Türkiye'ye tekrar günün fosili ödülü verildiğinde bu sefer Türkiye'ye haksızlık yapılmadığını düşünmeye başladık ve misyonumuzla uyumlu olarak konuyla ilgili faaliyetler gerçekleştirmemiz gerektiği sonucuna vardık. Bu çerçevede bir faaliyet olarak değerlendirebileceğiniz bugünkü etkinliğimizin Türkiye'de bir uyanışa vesile olmasını ve yıl sonunda yapılacak olan 19. taraflar toplantısının ülkemiz için öncekilerden daha hayırlı olmasını diliyor. Açılış konuşmasını yapmak üzere çok sevgili Sayın Rektörümüzü kürsüye davet ediyorum.
Değerli konuklar, sevgili meslektaşlarım, sevgili öğrenciler. Bugün üniversitemiz önemli bir konuşmacıyı, Hükümetler Arası İklim Değişikliği Paneli Başkanı Sayın Rajendra Pachauri'yi ağırlamaktadır. Kendisinin iklim değişikliği, enerji-çevre başlıklı konferansına hoş geldiniz, şeref verdiniz. Hepinizi saygı ve sevgiyle selamlıyorum. Our distinguished guests, it's a pleasure and honor to welcome you today to Boğaziçi University. Dear sir, indeed you are visiting one of the oldest campuses and the leading academic and research institutions of our region. Boğaziçi University was originally founded in 1863 as Robert College, being the first American institution of higher learning outside the borders of the United States. Since then, and the establishment of Boğaziçi University from Robert College in 1971, we have gone from strength to strength. We are now one of Turkey's premier universities with more than 13,000 of the brightest and best students. In our mission to become a green and sustainable university, we are committed to the protection of the environment and to the promotion of sustainable development on a global scale. Değerli konuklar, bildiğiniz gibi bu yıl üniversitemiz eğitim-öğretim geleneğinin 150. yılını kutlarken, kurum olarak benimsemiş olduğu değerleri ve ilkeleri dikkat çekmek ve farkındalık yaratmak üzere çeşitli etkinlikler düzenlemektedir. Bu kapsamda üniversitemiz 150 yıllık geçmişiyle yeşil kampüs yaşamını ve sürdürülebilirlik vizyonunu kurumsal değer olarak içselleştirmiş, stratejik hedef olarak benimsemiştir. Üniversitemiz 1982 yılında kurulmuş olan Çevre Bilimleri Enstitüsü'nde lisansüstü eğitim, öğretim, araştırmaları sürdürmekte, Sürdürülebilir Kalkınma Merkezi bünyesinde ve çeşitli disiplinlerden öğretim üyelerinin katılımları ile oluşturulmuş çok disiplinli çalışma grupları vasıtasıyla araştırmalarını yürütmektedir. Farklı kurumlarla ve üniversitelerle işbirliği içinde çok sayıda uluslararası ve ulusal projeyi başarıyla tamamlamıştır. Yenilebilir enerji teknolojileri kullanımı ve enerji verimliliği kapsamında güneş, rüzgar ve dalga enerjisi üretimi ve araştırmalarını desteklemekte. Karbon ayak izimizi sürekli aşağıya çekmekte. Kurum olarak tüm tüketim alışkanlıklarımızı dönüştürmeye, daha az çöp üretmeye, daha az enerji üretmeye, atıklarımızı değerlendirmeye çalışmaktayız. Yani çevre, enerji, iklim değişikliği ekosistemi içine giren her konuda eğitim, öğretim, araştırmaların yanı sıra idari uygulamalarımızla örnek teşkil etmeyi hedefledik. İklim değişikliği konusunda da Türkiye'de birçok ilkleri gerçekleştirdik. Türkiye'nin ilk kapsamlı karbondioksit hesaplamaları, farkındalık yaratma çalışmaları, ödeme istekliliği anketini düzenledik. Birleşmiş Milletler İklim Değişikliği Çerçeve Sözleşmesi yöntemleri ile uyumlu, temiz kalkınma projelerinin gelişmelerine katkı sağladık. Türkiye'nin Kyoto Protokolü'ne taraf olmasına yönelik ilk adımlar Boğaziçi Üniversitesi'nde atıldı. 2007 yılında Çevre Bakanlığı ve birçok sivil toplum kuruluşu işbirliği içinde Türkiye'nin enerji ve çevre politikaları ve Kyoto Protokolü'nün değerlendirmeleri üzerine bir dizi toplantıya ev sahipliği yaptık. Türkiye'nin ilk kapsamlı enerji planlama modeli ve enerji ekonomi çevre modeli Boğaziçi Üniversitesi'nde geliştirilerek ilgili makamlara sunulmuştur. Evet, Boğaziçi Üniversitesi olarak birçok şey yapmaktayız. Ülkemizde çok önemli çalışmalar yürütülmekte. Dünyada yoğun çalışmalar devam etmekte. Ancak acaba geldiğimiz nokta memnun edici midir? Değerli hocamız Gürkan Hoca'nın bana verdiği bilgiyi büyük bir üzüntüyle sizlerle paylaşmaktayım. Tam 10 gün önce atmosferdeki karbondioksit yoğunluğu milyonlarca yılın rekorunu kırarak 400 ppm seviyesine dayanmış, son 55 yılda %25 oranında artmıştır. Bu gidişatı tersine çevirecek her türlü girişimi tüm kurumlar desteklemek zorundadır. Salım azaltıcı teknolojilerin gelişmesini sağlayacak araştırmaları ciddiye almalı ve önemsemeliyiz. Bugün çok mutluyuz. Küresel ısınmayı önlemin eğitim ve araştırmadan geçtiğine inanarak ve sürdürülebilirlik vizyonunu benimsemiş bir yükseköğretim kurumu olarak Hükümetler Arası İklim Değişikliği Paneli Başkanı Sayın Pachauri'yi üniversitemize ağırlamaktan gurur duyuyoruz. Kendisinin vereceği, buradan vereceği, Türkiye'ye ve dünyaya vereceği mesajları heyecanla beklemekteyiz. Ben sözlerime son verirken bu toplantının düzenlemesine emeği geçen herkese ve çok önemli bir faaliyeti sürdürmekte olan Enerji Ekonomisi Derneği'ne teşekkürlerimi sunuyorum. Genç nesillere tüm çevre sorunlarının çözüldüğü bir dünyayı miras bırakmak üzere samimi ve etkin işbirlikleri temenni ediyor, saygı ve selamlarımı sunarken değerli konuşmacıyı kürsüye davet ediyorum. Please join me to invite Pachauri to the floor. Yes, please, sir.
Madam Rector of the University, Professor Gurkan Kumbaroglu, distinguished members of the faculty, ladies and gentlemen, I'm deeply privileged to be given this opportunity, and indeed I've been looking forward to it for a long time. On several previous occasions, unfortunately, I've had to postpone or cancel my trip over here. But perhaps that's all to the good, because It's a great privilege to be here during the 150th anniversary of this very distinguished institution. And I'm already a great admirer of what you have over here under the dynamic leadership of the rector of the university and the wonderful colleagues she has, who not only have the level of knowledge that is required to make an institution of learning, center of excellence, but also the right set of values. And here let me say that I've also been a great admirer of Turkish society. Turkey and the people of this country are clearly at the confluence of East and West, North and South, and that really is the spirit that is going to sustain human civilization. I think we have to get away from narrow labels of who is from the North, who is from the South, East or West. I think the world today clearly needs an integration of cultures, an integration of values, and a vision that would take us to a future that would be of value to our children, our grandchildren, and those who have yet to follow. And the truth is that today we do have very serious challenges. We have some threats which, if we do not take advantage of in terms of finding solutions to, then clearly we would be regarded as a very irresponsible generation. I'm particularly happy that I'm here at an event organized by the university and the International Association for Energy Economics. This is an organization that I had a great deal to do with when it was first established. And I might remind you that when I was the president of the association, the annual conference was held in Luxembourg. And by then, I had become deeply convinced about the science of climate change and how this is going to profoundly alter every activity on this planet. So when I spoke as president of the IAEE, I dwelt at length on issues of climate change and why energy economists should now start focusing on the problem of climate change. Of course, this was perhaps ahead of its time, so most of the delegates said that our president has gone mad. He's talking about climate change, what does that have to do with energy? Well, we know now what it has to do with energy. What I'm going to try to do in the time that is available to me is to give you some of the broad findings of the IPCC and the major issues that we have to deal with when understanding the complex challenge of climate change. So I'll start with the first slide. And we made a very simple, but I would say an extremely significant statement in the fourth assessment report of the IPCC, in which we said, warming of the climate system is unequivocal. And that means there is no room for doubt now that we are encountering warming of the climate system. That is an established fact. That is something that scientifically cannot be questioned anymore, and that's why we've used the word unequivocal. And to go on further, we have looked at the record of changes that have taken place since the beginning of industrialization. If you take the first picture over here, which gives you details of global average temperature and how it has changed, you would observe that there are fluctuations in this temperature. And those fluctuations are there because the climate of the Earth is influenced, of course, now more and more by human actions, but historically it has been affected by natural conditions. There is solar activity, there is volcanic activity, and all of that has a major impact on temperature changes. But what is particularly significant is that if you look at this graph, the last 50 or 60 years show a very clear upward trend. And that is what now a lot of scientists describe as the beginning of the period which you could call the Anthropocene. And it's called Anthropocene because human beings are now affecting this planet in a way that dominates all the natural factors that have been responsible for changes in the past. And if you see, since the middle of the last century, most of the increase in temperature which has taken place has been very steady and upward. And that is the imprint of human actions. Now, if you look at the 20th century as a whole, the total increase in temperature has been 0.74 degrees on average. The next picture gives you global average sea level rise. And this is the result of melting of the bodies of ice across the globe, most of which incidentally exist in the northern hemisphere, and thermal expansion of the ocean. As a result of which, in the 20th century, the increase in sea level has been about 17 centimeters. Now, 17 centimeters may not seem like a lot in many parts of the world, but if you're living in the Maldives Islands, for instance, where most of the islands, there are about 1,000 small islands which make up that nation, are barely 1 meter above sea level. And therefore, 17 centimeters represents a major threat, because you don't have to wait till those islands get completely submerged. Every time there's a storm surge, every time there's a weather event, then a higher sea level causes that much more damage. I remember in 1997, I was elected as vice chairman of the IPCC, and that meeting took place in the Maldives. And we had the then president of the Maldives, President Gayoom, who addressed us, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the place where you're holding your meeting today, 7 years ago was under 1.5 feet of water. That's because there was a major weather event, as a result of which the sea rolled over this particular island and covered it with water." So sea level rise is clearly a very serious problem for many parts of the world. The small island states, some of the low-lying coastal areas, such as Bangladesh, are going to be terribly threatened, and therefore we need to take that into account in coming up with adaptation measures. Now, the third picture over here gives you the northern hemisphere snow cover, and you can see that there's a tendency for it to decline. Why are we talking about the northern hemisphere snow cover? Well, because the largest land area on this planet is in the northern hemisphere. The southern hemisphere doesn't have that much land. So all of this is melting, and therefore you see a decline in snow cover in the northern hemisphere. Now, since 1950, extreme hot days and heavy precipitation have become more common. Now, this is something that came out of a special report that we did on extreme events, which was completed in 2011. And there is evidence that anthropogenic influences, including increasing atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations, have changed these extremes. So, human actions are not only leading to an increase in temperature, average temperature across the globe, but they are also influencing extreme events, particularly heat waves and heavy falls like rainfall, heavy snowfall, extreme precipitation events. And that clearly poses threats to life and property. Now, if we have to understand the causes of change, you can see that global greenhouse gas emissions due to human activities have grown since pre-industrial times, and it's a reason to be really concerned that between 1970 and 2004, they increased by 70%. Now that's a huge increase. And you all may have read just a few days ago, barely a week ago, we have received information, the world has received information that Mauna Loa, which is a site in Honolulu, where measurements have been made of carbon dioxide concentration over the last 50 years, has now crossed 400 parts per million. Before industrialization, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was 280 parts per million. We have now just crossed 400 parts per million. And if you look at CO2 annual emissions, they grew by about 80% between 1970 and 2004. Now, what you see at the bottom is an extremely significant statement. It says most of the observed increase in temperature since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. Now, when we use the term very likely, we are assigning a probability of over 90%. So there is a 90% probability that most of the increase that has taken place in temperatures since the middle of the last century is because of human actions. So that should hold us as a society totally responsible for what we are doing to the climate of this planet. You see, you'll read a lot of misinformation where people will say that, okay, if there is climate change, it is happening because of natural factors. In the fourth assessment report, we clearly provided these numbers over here. If you look at the black line, that gives you the historical increase in temperature since the beginning of the 20th century. If you look at what you would get, we ran a number of models, climate models, and I'm only trying to establish the fact that our climate models today have become so reliable that you can be absolutely certain that whatever projections we are getting are robust and can be relied on. Because if you look at the past, then we run these models using only natural forcings, that means factors that have changed naturally, solar activity, volcanic activity, and so on. Then you get a set of numbers, which is that blue band at the bottom. So in other words, natural factors do not explain the changes in temperature that have actually taken place. However, when you run it with human-induced factors, that means the increase in concentration of greenhouse gases, then you get more or less a perfect fit, which is the black line coinciding with the pink line. So the point I'm trying to make is that our models today are totally capable of being able to give you the influence of natural factors as well as human-induced factors. And as you can see, a large part of the explanation of the change in temperature comes from the human factors, which is increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases. If you look at projected impacts, we have reason to be concerned. Globally, commercial forestry productivity rises modestly with climate change. Why? Because carbon dioxide concentrations have gone up, and carbon dioxide, of course, in photosynthesis has an extremely important role to play. But as far as agriculture is concerned, then overall there's going to be an increasing negative impact of climate change on agriculture. In fact, we had projected very clearly that in some parts of Africa, as early as 2020, we might get up to a 50% decline in yields on account of climate change and climate variability. Now that I think can cause very serious problems, simply because most of these poor farmers are producing food barely for their own consumption. And there's already a lot of malnutrition and hunger in several parts of the world. So if productivity goes down, then people will not be able to get enough food to be able to keep themselves in a healthy condition, and therefore malnutrition and hunger would only grow as a result. Also, if you look at the third statement over here, projected climate change has significant consequences for food insecurity due to reduced crop yield. So it also has a major impact globally on food security. And therefore, this is something that we have to be concerned about. Now, there are many millions of people who are projected to be flooded every year due to sea level rise by the 2080s. And the numbers will be largest in the mega deltas. Which are the mega deltas? Shanghai, Dhaka, Kolkata, and of course in Egypt along the delta of the Nile River. So these are areas that are extremely vulnerable, and of course the small island states are very, very vulnerable, as I mentioned earlier. The most vulnerable industries and settlements, etc., are basically those which are sensitive to temperature, hours of sunshine, precipitation, humidity, storm intensity and frequency. In other words, all these climate-related factors, those habitations, those cities which are most sensitive to changes in these will be the ones that would be affected very badly. And the last point is, we are all stakeholders in climate change and its impacts. When I had the privilege of accepting the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the IPCC, in my speech, I invoked an expression that comes from Sanskrit in India, and that expression is Vasudev Kutumbakam in Sanskrit, which means the universe is one family. So we cannot start believing that we are safe and that the rest of the world can look after itself, because whatever happens in the rest of the world will also affect us. We are now living in a globalized society. We are living in a world where information flows very rapidly, and anything that happens in Somalia or Sudan or any other part of the world has a direct impact on all of us. I know Turkey is now going through a very difficult time in the neighborhood, but there are societies much further away that would also be affected by developments that are taking place in your neighborhood. Europe will have certain negative impacts as a result of climate change. More North Sea storms leading to increases in storm surges along the North Sea coast, especially in Denmark. So the Nordic countries will be affected by this. There will be health risks due to heat waves, and I don't have to remind you about what happened in the year 2003, mainly in Paris and France, but that led to a large number of deaths and illnesses throughout Europe. Reduction of water availability and crop productivity in southern Europe. This, of course, has very serious implications, because southern Europe is particularly vulnerable to a reduction in water availability, and therefore that has implications for agriculture. Species losses and reduced snow cover in the mountains. Reduced snow cover in the mountains would have implications, of course, for tourism, but also in terms of water flows that would be important for those areas which are dependent on rivers that originate in the high mountains. And a changing climate leads to changes in extreme weather and climate events, as I mentioned. There will be increasing vulnerability, exposure, or severity and frequency of climate events, which increases disaster risk. You've seen a number of disasters taking place all over the world recently. I spent time at Yale University, and the northeast of the US has been particularly vulnerable. We had Superstorm Sandy, which devastated that region of the country, including the city of New York. And therefore, what we really need to do is to factor these into our adaptation measures for the future, about which I'll say a little more. Now, unfortunately, the worst victims are people who are in the developing countries, because we have collected data from 1970 to 2008, and over 95% of the natural disaster-related deaths have occurred in the developing countries. Why is that? Well, if you look at the difference, let us say in Bangladesh you have a terrible cyclone. Hundreds and thousands of people are likely to die because there's no proper early warning system, you don't have proper transportation, you don't have shelters where people can seek relief. But if a similar cyclone or hurricane was to hit the coast of Florida, you get early warning. So people will board up their windows, they'll nail pieces of wood on top of them so that the windows remain safe. They'll get into their pickup trucks or station wagons and drive off to a safe location. You can't do that in a developing country. So in a developing country, the impacts are extremely serious, and that's why you can see that 95% of the deaths that took place in this period was in the developing countries. Now, effective risk management and adaptation are tailored to local and regional needs and circumstances. Adaptation is clearly an initiative that has to be taken at the local level. If there are people living in coastal areas which are threatened by sea level rise and climate-related events, then possibly you need to do what the Netherlands has done. The Netherlands has got dikes because a large part of that country is below sea level, and therefore the only way you can keep the sea out is by constructing dikes. And in the Netherlands today, they are strengthening these dikes and making them taller. Can you do that in some of the developing countries in the world? No, because they don't have the resources. But there are things you can do, like early warning systems. If people get early warning, then, you know, poor people are often very resilient. They can improvise, they can come up with measures by which they can save themselves and their families. So, there are a number of adaptation measures. If you look at agriculture, which is likely to be affected adversely by the impacts of climate change, perhaps what we need to do is to change our cropping patterns, change our practices, and research and development can help us come up with seeds that would be resistant to drought and the changed climatic conditions. So changes in climate extremes vary across regions. Each region has unique vulnerabilities and exposure to hazards, and effective risk management and adaptation address the factors contributing to exposure and vulnerability. For this, it is also crucial that we have effective and good governance at the local level. Because if you don't have good governance at the local level, then people will become victims of the impacts of climate change. There are, of course, limits of adaptation. Societies have had a long record of adapting to changes in the weather and the climate, and adaptation is necessary to address impacts resulting from the warming, which is already unavoidable due to past emissions, because there's a certain inertia, there's a certain momentum in the system. Whatever we do today will not stop changes in climate because there's such a huge quantity of concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that climate change will continue for several decades into the future. Excuse me. Adaptation to the impacts of climate change and promotion of sustainable development, they share common goals. Because if you pursue sustainable development, then you're also taking care of the ecosystems around you, you're taking care of those measures by which you can also be able to adapt to some of the worst impacts of climate change. But adaptation alone will not be enough. Neither adaptation nor mitigation alone can avoid all climate change impacts. However, they can complement each other and together can significantly reduce the risks of climate change. So the point I'd like to make is adaptation is a local activity. It has to be done to protect, to minimize the risks of people at the local level. But mitigation has to take place globally. You have to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases on a global basis. That means those countries which are in a position to reduce these and have high levels of emissions are the ones that must take the first steps. Now, here I want to emphasize something. and I'm only drawing your attention to the first row of numbers over here. If we want to limit global mean temperature increase to say 2 degrees to 2.4 degrees Celsius, and if we want to do it at least cost, then CO2 emissions need to peak no later than 2015. That's only 2 years away. So if we are serious about meeting this goal of a 2-degree limit on temperature increase, and if we want to do it at least cost, then we only have 2 years to make sure that carbon dioxide emissions will peak and will start reducing thereafter. Now, we are often told that this is going to be very expensive to the world and human society will suffer if we go for mitigation. Nothing could be further from the truth. We have estimated that if we were to carry out stringent mitigation, then the top line is, the red line shows you GDP growth without mitigation. The bottom line, the blue line, gives you GDP growth with mitigation. And the difference we have estimated in 2030 will be less than 3% of the global GDP, which means that the level of prosperity that we would reach in 2030 would at worst be delayed by a few months or by a year. And that's clearly not a very high price to pay for saving some of the most vulnerable communities from the worst impacts of climate change. And there are many co-benefits from mitigation, because if we carry out mitigation of emissions of greenhouse gases, we'll also be reducing the emissions of local pollutants, and that would carry huge health benefits. We would also be ensuring that there will be greater employment, there'll be much higher levels of energy security, and of course, as I mentioned, local environmental benefits. So what we really need to do is to link our development policies so that we can come up with no regrets measures that would reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases and create development at the same time. Now, we brought out a special report in 2011 on climate change, on renewable energy and climate change mitigation. And as you would see over here, this gives you the costs of different forms of energy production. Interestingly, in a number of cases, the cost of renewable energy competes with the cost of conventional forms of energy. I would normally have shown you a 3-minute video, but I don't want to impose that on you. But in my institute, Terry, we have launched a major program called Lighting a Billion Lives. Why have we done that? Well, because there are 1.3 billion people in the world today who have no access to electricity. So we have designed solar lanterns, and these solar lanterns are provided in the villages, and one woman is trained to charge them using solar energy with a panel on her roof. She charges these lanterns during the daytime and rents them out at night to all the villagers. And the cost that the villagers have to pay is no more than the cost of kerosene if they were using kerosene in lanterns. And kerosene, as you know, also creates a lot of pollution. So you have women and children sitting around these kerosene lamps, and they are inhaling all those harmful emissions. We have covered over 2,000 villages in India and many in Africa, and by the end of this financial year, we'll cover 5,000 villages. And this is a program which is catching on all over the world. So the point I'm trying to make is that for some applications, renewable energy is economically attractive even today. And therefore, I think those who are in the business of energy economics must start looking at these options. The cost of photovoltaics has come down substantially in the last 2 or 3 years, and that changes the picture radically. But there are other technologies also which are now very, very attractive. Now, in a significant increase in the deployment of renewable energy by 2030, 2050 and beyond is indicated in the majority of 164 scenarios that we have assessed in the IPCC. Different researchers have come up with scenarios of renewable energy use in the future, and 164 that we examined. And clearly, there is a great future for renewable energy. And a transition to higher shares of renewable energy would imply increasing investments in technology and in infrastructure. I mean, let us say if we were to go in for electric vehicles that are going to be run with renewable energy, then you will need solar charging stations all along the highway. You would need electric vehicles that can go there and charge quickly, or it could be charged in your home if you had a solar panel on the roof. That energy could be stored at night and it can charge your vehicle so that you can run it in the city. So there are all kinds of policies that would be required to bring about a deployment of these renewable energy technologies. And policies would include regulation, financial incentives, public finance mechanisms, and carbon pricing mechanisms. So what is crucially important is that if we want a renewable energy future, if we want a sustainable future, then we have to come up with policies today that would give us the kinds of results 10, 15, 20 years from now. And this is where I think institutions like this, universities of great renown, can influence policies by informing policymakers about the change in costs, the change in economics, and the benefits of sustainable development that society would be able to harness. Okay, now I come to this important slide. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has Article 2 at the very core of this Framework Convention, and the purpose of the convention is stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. Now we have to ask ourselves, are we really protecting this planet? Are we protecting society to see that this Article 2 of the Framework Convention is fully observed? We apparently are not, and therefore I think human society has to do much more. And I'll end with this quotation from Mahatma Gandhi when he said, "Speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction." We, as it happens, measure economic progress on the basis of GDP, but if the manner in which we are increasing our GDP results in a decline in the natural resources of this planet, the natural wealth that we have, the global commons like the air that we breathe, the waters that we see in our rivers and in the oceans, then clearly there is something wrong, and that means we are going in the wrong direction, and therefore speed is irrelevant. Thank you very much.
Well, Pachauri, thank you very much for this very enlightening and informative talk. I would like to welcome you on the desk to open the floor. Thank you very much. It was a very informative talk indeed. And I have got a couple of questions, but I would like to start with the audience. Questions from the audience? Or, yes, please.
I have two questions and one issue. First is,
sorry, can you wait for the micro, please? And brief questions, but your name, surname, okay, and organization,
my name is Bahadur, and I am a student in environmental science in Boğaziçi University. My question is that, is it really possible to sustain a civilization which is from its foundation unsustainable and invasive? Isn't the collapse inevitable, only a matter of time? Please consider last 10 years political and economic developments, record CO2 emissions in 2012 and 13, and lack of any realistic projection for carbon-free industrial economy. Second question. How can you simply sustainably consume any resources which is disappearing naturally? Please consider sustainable living, farming, fishery practices under rapid climate change and ocean acidification conditions. Third, is it not wiser for Homo sapiens to let the collapse this civilization survive after the collapse, create a new sustainable one, rather than hopelessly try to prolong life of this a truly unsustainable one? Thank you.
Yes, that's
I didn't get your last question, sir.
Is it not wiser for us, Homo sapiens, to let this civilization collapse and to survive after the collapse and create a new, really sustainable one, rather than desperately fighting to prolong its life?
Interesting. Okay. Shall I respond to these questions then?
Yes, I think we proceed one by one.
Well, I think I would like to draw the distinction between a pessimistic view and an optimistic view. And let me give you a little anecdote about a pessimistic view. There was one planet that was crossing another planet in outer space, and this planet asked the other, "How is the universe?" And the other planet answered, "The universe is fine. But there is one particular planet that I'm very worried about." So which one? Is this planet called Earth. Why? What's wrong with it? So, well, what's really wrong with it is that there's a species over there called human beings, and they are destroying everything. So this wise planet says, well, don't worry, they're not going to last very long. So in a sense, that refers to your third question. But you know, I would like to take an optimistic view. Last week, I was in Washington, D.C., and we had Mr. Al Gore with us, who's a good friend. And he made a very important point. He said, 40 years ago, in the United States, you found black and white people not sitting in the same bus. Today, that has changed. I mean, you dare not draw any distinction between races in the US. He said 20 years ago, people who were homosexual did not mention it at all. Today, you have countries where it is legitimate. It has been accepted. So the point he was trying to make is that, you know, when change takes place, it can take place radically and substantially. Now, my own belief is, if human society understands what we are doing to the ecosystems of this planet, what we are doing to the climate of this planet, you will see a groundswell of efforts to say we've got to change, let's change immediately. So my belief and my hope is that that's the kind of response that we will get. And therefore, I wouldn't want this civilization to collapse. I would like to see that we correct the situation well before the collapse. Right? So, I would say that, yes, several of our practices are unsustainable today, but we have the power, we have the capacity, we have the technologies, and can develop further technologies and changes in lifestyles by which we can really make this planet a sustainable planet for all to live in.
Thank you, Dr. Pachauri. I'm overwhelmed, very happy to hear that you're optimistic. Although in this environment where our rector has told us, and we all know, 10 days ago, 400 ppm concentration level has been reached. And I have compared this concentration level with the projections you had in the fourth assessment report. And this compares to the upper bound of the scenarios, in spite of the economic crisis we had. So this makes me a bit more pessimistic.
Oh, you're right. I mean, often, you know, human society needs some kind of a trigger. We have to cross some kind of a tipping point for us to wake up. And I hope we are getting close to that point. And when that happens, my hope is that we all will wake up and really bring about major changes. I personally believe that we also need an alteration of value systems. And that's why I believe that a society like Turkish society, which has such a rich history, you have a wealth of culture and beliefs, and a certain cohesiveness in society, by which if you start doing something, then everybody will follow. My belief is something like that is going to happen very soon. And of course, if it doesn't happen very soon, then I think there is a basis for being pessimistic. But I'd like to be optimistic, and I believe society will wake up rather quickly.
I hope so as well. Other questions, please. Yes.
Hello, thank you very much, Mr. Pachauri. It was an excellent presentation and very enlightening, but there are many other actually questions that we would love to hear answers to. My name is Sibel. I'm the director of the Regional Environmental Center in Turkey. Well, I have a couple remarks, let's say. You mentioned that local governance is very important. Of course, global governance is just as important. So maybe this is an area where you can touch on a little bit, because climate change, the global climate change governance is not doing so well. It's not going, the negotiations are not really progressing as fast as we would like them to. So by 2015, a policy framework is supposed to be developed. How do you think that's progressing, and how is the science policy interface? Because we've always observed that there was a lack of cooperation between science and policymakers. You also mentioned that you are actually hopeful that, let's say you're in Turkey now, so I will ask a question about Turkey. Actually, when you mentioned that there should no longer be north-south divide, that we're all on the same planet, in reality, this is hard to achieve. Even here in Turkey, our policymakers strongly believe that we have a right to develop, that we are a developing country, and although we have the highest emissions in Annex I countries recently, we strongly believe we have a right to increase this increase, so we're not taking any commitments in the negotiations, except for very light commitments, business as usual. You know, it's not strong commitments. So, how do you see the solution in enabling the north-south divide to be reduced? Let's say. I mean, what do you do in your panel discussions? How do you solve it? Thank you.
I think these are all very good questions. Let me try to answer your last question or your last issue first. I'll go back to what Gandhi said. Speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. If we believe that right to develop means right to pollute this earth more, then I think we need to re-examine this. And I'll give you another anecdote from Gandhi. He was once asked, I think by a British journalist, Mr. Gandhi, wouldn't you want India to reach the same level of prosperity as Britain? And his answer was, it took Britain to use half the resources of this planet to reach its level of prosperity. He said, how many planets would a country like India require? So the point is that if the rest of the world has adopted a pattern of growth, which is causing enormous problems, should we not wake up? Because if you reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, as I indicated, you also create a lot of local benefits, lower levels of emissions at the local level. And I've been saying this to our own policymakers at the highest level in India, that we need to for instance, exploit solar energy on a much larger scale. We have an abundance of solar energy, and if you look at the market 10 or 20 years in the future, these are technologies that are going to be extremely important. I would like to see India become a leader in solar technologies. So I think there are huge benefits in bringing about a sharp deviation in the pattern of development than to say that we'll continue to do what the rest of the world has done. Because that, to my mind, is, as they say, cutting your nose to spite your face. What are we trying to prove by increasing our emissions and pursuing a path of development which we know is causing serious problems? And bringing about change is not an expensive issue at all. If you look at even the developed countries, you find several countries which have the same level of prosperity, but very different levels of per capita emissions, which means that you can do it and yet not lose the good things in life, the prosperity that we have become accustomed to. In Europe itself, you look at the policies of Germany, they are distinctly different from other parts of Europe. Germany is, of course, spending a lot of money in developing renewable energy technologies, but even if you look at the growth rate in Germany, it's better than that of many countries in Europe. So I think we have to use our imagination, and once again I come back to what I said earlier. It is institutions like this that can enlighten the public, can enlighten our policymakers, and show us that in actual fact, you'll be far better off if you brought about a change today than to wait till we are all forced to do it. So I think we need to exercise some voluntary choices in this regard, and that would happen if people get educated, people understand and are aware of what the current pattern of development is actually doing to this planet and to all of us.
Thank you. Muzaffer Bey.
Muzaffer Başaran, World Energy Council, Turkish National Committee. You know, in the world, when you look at United States and China, they produce almost 50% of the emission. You know, we always appreciate your studies, but I think you should especially focus on these two countries so that the world can be saved. And the other subject is, you know, you mentioned about Germany. When you mentioned about Germany, I remind you this Gandhi's saying, speed is irrelevant if you are going in the wrong direction. You know, they stopped 8 nuclear power plants, so they are using more coal, more gas, and they are importing nuclear energy from France. So I think at the moment Germany is not the right example. Thank you.
Okay, I take that point. I was only trying to illustrate the fact that, you know, you have different levels of energy consumption per capita, different emissions in different countries. If you look at Japan, for instance, which is the third most prosperous country in the world, their energy consumption per capita is much lower than that of other equally rich countries in North America, for instance. So the only point I was trying to make is that development can follow different paths as far as energy intensity is concerned. So that I believe is just an illustration, maybe not the best example to give. I'm sorry, I've lost sight of your first question, sir. Yes, yes. You know, it's interesting. In China, for instance, there's a major change that is taking place. In fact, my institute is now launching a study with the Chinese and with the Chinese government on looking at low carbon development in China and India. Because I think the leadership over there has realized that you have to start looking at a low carbon pattern of development. You're aware of some of the major environmental problems that China has. And to be able to solve them, you would necessarily have to come up with a very different path of development, which is much lower in terms of energy intensity. China is also investing heavily in renewable energy. In the case of the US, I'm quite happy with some of the things that are happening in some cities, some states. California has been ahead of the rest of the country. Yes, I agree at the federal level they haven't been able to do what they had always intended to, but I think people are now getting very aware of what is needed. I have a colleague at Yale University who carries out regular surveys of public opinion on climate change. And the last 3 or 4 months, his surveys have shown a dramatic shift. Now, whether this is a permanent shift in public opinion or just something which is a response to Superstorm Sandy, we don't know. But if it is a fairly strong and permanent shift, I think it's good news. That means people are now going to start doing something by which they cut down on their energy consumption. And there is a lot of waste in that society as well as in other society where you can adopt excuse me, low regrets measures, low cost measures. And we had estimated, in fact, in the 4th assessment report, that in 2030, the world will have potential for reducing 6 gigatons of CO2 equivalent of gases at negative cost. So in other words, you can actually make money if you adopt some of those measures. In the US and in many parts of the world, buildings are a huge consumer of electricity. And I think if we had the right measures, you could cut down on energy use in buildings without sacrificing comfort. So we need regulation, we need incentives, we need disincentives, and I hope, even if the federal government doesn't do very much, if local governments start taking some steps, then we'll get these kinds of results.
Dr. Pachauri, I would like to ask, combining the previous question, the global governance, with the international aspect, because more than 20% of global emissions are associated with the international trade of goods. Do you envision a future where emissions embodied in bilateral trade?
It's entirely possible because, you know, you've seen what is happening in the EU with aviation. And they are imposing a carbon tax on all flights that come to Europe and take off from Europe. And they have problems with China and India right now. But it's entirely possible that you could have a carbon price or a carbon tax added on to the price of goods and services, not only for international trade, but also for domestic markets. And when that happens, then clearly there will be a very strong signal in the market for lower carbon intensity products and processes coming into existence. And maybe the IAE could come up with a policy paper on this, which would inform the rest of the world.
Sure. Thank you. At the back there is some, yes, Mavili arkadaşımız bekliyoruz.
Hello, my name is Yavuz Yiğit. I have a social institution which tries to convince people to do good things, like helping kids, helping environment, helping animals. While we are talking about the environment, while we are trying to convince people to reduce their carbon emission, the other argument is very strong, because they're saying in the short run, your factory will be closed and you're going to be jobless to the people. And the public is buying that argument rather than there will be floods in Pakistan, the Holland will be under the sea in 30 years. It's really hard to convince them when you're trying to make there will be something bad in 30 years. So, and also when you're saying them, your children will be in trouble in 40 years, they're saying, okay, it's their problem, they will fix it anyway, and there will be and second argument they are saying, our friend, our colleague over here said, okay, the France is doing it, China is doing it, USA is doing it, so we can do it too. While we are working with those people, what would you recommend us to tell them and convince them not to do these kind of stuff what you have just mentioned? Thank you.
Firstly, what we're talking about is not going to be 40 years in the future, it is now. You know, and this is where I think the scientific community has to spread information that the impacts of climate change are being felt worldwide even today. I just want to give you one fact. We have estimated that if nothing is done about climate change, then those heat waves, which currently take place today, once in 20 years, will by the end of this century take place once in 2 years. And this is going to get progressively worse. And we already see heat waves taking place all over the world. We see extreme precipitation events, that means very heavy rainfall, very heavy snowfall taking place in short periods of time. So I think what we really need to do is to convince people that the impacts of climate change are already taking place. And I think we also need to inform them on the basis of local assessment of what these impacts are. Now here, may I say, much of this requires a great deal of climate modeling. And institutions have to get involved. For instance, if you take this university, perhaps you could have a group of climate modelers, and these models will have to be run on supercomputers to come up with estimates of the impacts in this region. And if this could be done in different parts of the country, then people would realize what is already happening. So may I say that the intellectual community now has a new responsibility, because we are dealing with, this was a question that was asked earlier about the interface between science and policy. Today, scientists have a much bigger responsibility to provide policy-relevant knowledge than was the case earlier. And I hope if people can be informed about what's happening today, what's going to happen in the future, then they will be convinced. They would realize that they have to take action. Plus, if they realize that taking action is not expensive, and it has a whole lot of other co-benefits, as I tried to point out, then maybe you are making a strong case for people to get involved. So I would submit that if in your efforts, which I think are very noble, if you could inform people that climate change is not something in the future, it is already happening, then maybe people will give you a better response.
Thank you. Beyazlı bir bey var orada. Evet, tabii, beyaz gömlek.
My name is Muhittin Mungan. I'm from the physics department from this university. And I wanted to ask you one question. Now, I mean, it's of course, it's the projections are on the average temperature rises, but of course the temperature is not going to rise everywhere by the amount of the average, but there are going to be, of course, regions where the temperature is going to rise more than in other regions. And of course that renders the risks that those regions will become less favorable to be habited, you know, so you could expect people to migrate, and so there should be, you know, there's also social changes that could come with it. Could you comment a little bit more on that, please?
Okay. No, I think that's a very good question. Let me mention that even today, the Arctic is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the globe. And that's one reason why the Arctic ice is melting. Now, I'm going to be there in a week from now. I'll be going to the Arctic region. I've been there before. I've been to Greenland. And clearly, the rate of warming over there is much higher. Similarly, in the case of sea level rise, even though we give numbers of average sea level rise, there are some parts of the world where the sea level, on account of the pattern of currents and everything, will be much higher than in other areas. So you're absolutely right. The impacts are differential from one place to the other. They are not uniform. And climate refugees is a complete reality. I mean, if in parts of Africa you already have water stress, and that water stress is going to become much worse, where will people go? They will move to other places where at least they have enough water to drink. So this is already happening. And I think Europe is not immune. You would find a lot of people wanting to come here as illegal immigrants, because if they can't even live in the places which are being affected by climate change, they're going to move illegally. They'll do anything to be able to live wherever they can. So I think I go back to what I said earlier, the universe is one family. I mean, we cannot shut our eyes to the fact that the impacts of climate change will be much worse in some places than in others. But that means that everybody is going to be affected. Nobody is going to be immune to these. So that's a good point, and I think we need to make this known to people, and they should understand what we are doing to several societies. I mean, there are some cynical people who will say that it's cheaper for the world to move the few thousands of people in the small island states to some other home. But are we not respecting their culture? Are we not respecting the fact that their fathers, their grandfathers lived on those islands? They would like to continue their life in the same way. Why should they become part of the city of Berlin or Istanbul or London? Why should we not create conditions by which people can live and exercise choices the way that they have over hundreds and thousands of years? So I think these are issues that are very deeply rooted in the ethics of our decision making. We must look at the ethical and the equitable dimensions of climate change as well. We are trying to do that in the 5th assessment report, which is going to come out completely by the end of 2014.
İlk sırada Yıldız Hocam'ın sorusu vardı.
Mr. Pachauri, Dr. Pachauri, the 5th assessment report of IPCC is on its way. I think it's soon going to be announced. So, what would you say about the findings and recommendations, assessments of the 5th report? Is it going to be much different than the 4th assessment report, and if so, in what specific areas it will be? Thank you.
Well, it will be an update of knowledge, and you know, the last report was published in 2007. Since then, a lot of new material has become available, and as you know, the IPCC functions on the basis of literature that we review. We don't do any research of our own, original research of our own. We look at all the research which has been published, and on that basis we assess various aspects of climate change. Now, in the 5th assessment report, therefore, some of our conclusions will be stronger. Some of our conclusions will have lower uncertainties attached to them. There are also some new topics that we are focusing on, like aerosols and cloud cover. What is their impact on climate change? We'll have much greater regional detail. And as I mentioned, we're also looking at some of the ethical and equitable dimensions, because particularly in mitigation, that's going to be very important. Who should do more, who should do less, and why? So I think there will be a fair amount of new information and material. But may I say that it's not going to be dramatically different from what we have had in the 4th assessment report. And the 4th assessment report has a substantial amount of literature, a substantial amount of findings by which we should be taking action. There is enough information over there for human society to take action.
Yes, please. İkinci sıradaki beyefendiye mikrofonu verebilir miyiz?
Dr. Pachauri, my name is Taner Aksel. I did my master's on structural behavior under earthquakes, and I found similarities between how buildings collapse, economic crises, and climate change. Wrote a book about it. And after that, I started working on sustainability, and I believe we're living in such a dilemma because if we don't take responsibility ourselves, then the other things are meaningless. So it's on our shoulders and it's very difficult to reach out to people because the number of people here, you're one of the most influential people on climate change. On Saturday, we tried to do a sustainability day, handed out thousands of flyers, mails, and only 15 people came over. So it's very difficult to reach out to people, and I would like to learn if there is a solution, how we can do this. And also, I would like to ask how many people in this room have solar panels in their roofs? Because if we don't do this, the people who know, then how can we expect any change from the public? So also how to come together and work better as a group so we can do something about it.
I think that's a very good point. And again, I turn to Gandhi. He would say, be the change you want to see in the world. If you want the world to do something, you start yourself. And I'll give you another anecdote from his life. A woman brought her son to Gandhi and said, I want you to talk to this young child and tell him to eat less sweets. He's consuming too much sugar. So Gandhi said, okay, I'll give him advice, but you come back to me after 10 days. So she went away, but came back after 10 days. And then he spoke to the young boy and told him why eating too much sugar is not good for him, the harm that it could do, and so on. So the mother was quite satisfied, but she said, why did you take 10 days to give him this advice? Why couldn't you give him this advice that day? And he said, you know, the moment you mentioned this to me, it occurred to me that I myself was eating too much sugar. So I had to practice what I was going to preach. And in the last 10 days, I've cut down my sugar intake. Now I can talk to him with a clean conscience. So I agree with you. We have to start doing these things ourselves. Now, frankly, how do you get the message across? I would like to see faith leaders also start talking about these issues. You see, every religion of the world gives us respect for nature. There is not a single religion in the world that says that you can destroy nature, you can damage nature. And I would like to see faith leaders, right from the Pope to the Imams, to the Jewish faith and everyone, telling people that we have to use the resources of this planet with a certain level of sanctity and with a certain level of respect. I think we have to use every source of influence to give people the facts, to tell them the scientific truth, and then people will do what is right for them. Unfortunately, today, I think as we learned earlier, people believe, oh, well, this is going to happen 50 years from now, why should I worry? And if you tell them about their children, my children are smart enough, they'll know how to deal with the problem. But that's not true. The truth is that we are facing the problem today and it's going to get much worse tomorrow. And therefore, I think everyone in a position of influence, including our political leaders, have to start understanding the scientific truth behind climate change. Maybe this university and institutions like this can make a difference.
Yes, questions from the middle part of the audience. Ali Kerem.
My name is Ali Saysel. I'm from the Environmental Institute of this university. I'd like to refer to Gandhi as well, but maybe we can read that quote in a more fruitful way in this context. Maybe we can say that speed is relevant if you are going in the right direction.
Yes.
So I think here, the audience here, we are almost all convinced that climate change is a problem. UNFCCC is something in the right direction. IPCC is doing something good. But the speed is the problem. And we know that there is significant time lag between emissions and concentration. to reach at some desired concentration level, we have to speed up, dramatically reduce our emissions. And we know that there is even a higher time lag between concentrations and the temperatures, which trigger climate change on Earth. So the speed is something very important. And then this is my criticism to your institution, the way you communicate the findings, the literature, the emerging knowledge on climate change to wider audience on Earth. I think we should more focus on how we can achieve some target concentration levels, what type of emission paths, of course within their uncertainty bounds. And also we must communicate the most recent findings on temperature change, some target temperature levels, and how we can achieve those target temperatures with what type of emission trajectories. I think these targets are very important for the policymakers as well as the general public to try to do something good for the climate.
No, I think those are very good comments, and I'm grateful to you for at least one sentence that you spoke, that the IPCC is doing good work. There are lots of people who believe that the IPCC should be bombed from the face of this earth. So thank you for that comment. But I think you're right. We have been rather poor in communicating our findings and our science. And this is a major weakness with the scientific community. I have no hesitation in saying that. But you'll be glad to know that in the 5th assessment report, we are going to do precisely what you've suggested. We're going to show pathways by which emissions will have to be reduced to reach, let's say, 2-degree increase in temperature, to stabilize 2-degree increase in temperature, 1.5-degree increase in temperature, and equivalent variables. So hopefully we would be able to show which way the world has to go. And you're absolutely right. In looking at the positive side of Gandhi's statement, speed is highly relevant if you're going in the right direction. But I think he made that statement because he felt that the world is going in the wrong direction. He was also asked on one occasion, what do you think of wildlife? He says, yes, it's a very serious problem. Wildlife is decreasing in the jungles, but wildlife is growing in the cities. And I think that was absolutely right. But yes, we should be measuring how we are proceeding in the right direction. So hopefully the 5th assessment report will give us some basis by which we can chart the pathway to the future that we would like to adopt.
Another question right behind Ali Kerem.
Thank you. I'm Gökşen from Tema Foundation. It's a Turkish non-governmental organization. And I have a question about the new agreement or something that is going to come out from the Durban platform, actually. We know the urgency that the meeting in Bonn started with the statement of Christiana Figueres, which mentions the urgency to act on climate change. And we don't see that much, how can I say, that much action in the Durban platform that will come out with an agreement of urgency in 2015. I want to ask you about your ideas on this issue.
Okay. Well, frankly, I would prefer not to comment on what is happening with the negotiations. If I see you outside, I'll be very happy to have a personal conversation on the subject. But, I mean, there's no getting away from the fact that we've had 18 conferences of the parties. And you have to ask yourself, have we really achieved what the UN Framework Convention intended to? And the answer would be no. Yes, there is a lot of time that is spent in each of the COPs, 2 weeks of discussions and debate. But I would like to ask, of those 2 weeks, how many days are actually spent in looking at the scientific realities by which we should be taking action? I mean, how much time is spent in assessing the impacts of climate change on the small island states, on Bangladesh, on Myanmar, on some of the more vulnerable regions of the world? How much time is spent in looking at and evaluating various options by which we can mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases? Very little. So I'm afraid we really need to go in a somewhat different direction. But I wouldn't want to say anything more than that at this point of time. I'd be happy to discuss it with you through email, or if we have an opportunity to converse about it. I personally think we need some changes. There's no question about it.
Özgür Bey had a question there.
Teşekkür ederim. Özgür Gürbüz, Bir Gün Gazetesi'nden. Kulaklığınız yok, ben de İngilizce sorayım. So there is a country who increased the greenhouse gas emissions 124% based on 1990. And the greenhouse gas emissions of this country come from 80% of it from the energy sector. And per capita emissions now 5.7%, and last year it was 5.2%. And the top officials of this country still denies to take any action on climate change or like commit for any target, which is measurable. Instead, they want actually more money and then to be included in the carbon emission sector. And the future plans of this country is doubling its installed capacity on an energy sector, and which is again, nearly 80% of this capacity will be again gas and coal as right now. So what would you recommend this country, which has also the best potential in solar and wind energy in Europe, and the 7th biggest potential in geothermal, and the energy intensity figures are awful, 3 times higher than Germany. What would you recommend this country, which path to go? Take no action and blame China? Or would you give a fossil fuel award to this country if you had a chance? Thank you.
Well, I'm really not qualified to provide any advice to this country. The good thing is Turkey is a democracy, and I think governments will react to what people want the government to do. So I would say it is for people to raise the issues of the choices that the country has, and I'm sure with the enlightened government that you have, you would be able to choose the right path for development. For me to offer any advice would be rather arrogant, if I may say so. I can provide all the information that is available on the science of climate change, on the findings of the IPCC, and all of that clearly requires every country, including this one, to adapt to the impacts of climate change and to mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases. And I'll repeat once more that by mitigating those emissions, you also realize a huge amount of local benefits. So if you can get me an audience with political decision makers over here, I promise you I'll fly down here and make a 20-minute presentation to them. And then I leave it to the democratic forces in this society to bring about the change that you're looking for.
Thank you. Dr. Pachauri, Turkish energy policy appears to dominate being based on currently coal, renewables, and nuclear power. Does the IPCC have a viewpoint on nuclear power?
Yes, in the 4th assessment report, for the first time, we assessed nuclear energy. We never did it in the previous reports. And we clearly said that, nuclear was then providing 17% of the electricity supplied in the world, and therefore it had a future. But we also highlighted some of the problems with nuclear energy. And those are risks of accidents, there are problems of storage of spent fuel, and a whole range of other issues that require a country to evaluate whether it wants to go in for nuclear energy. And there again, I would say, if governments and the people are made aware of both the downsides and the benefits of nuclear energy, then hopefully we'll get some rational decisions. But we have assessed nuclear energy in the previous report, and we'll do that in the current report also.
Thank you. Other questions? From the very back, there is one question.
Hello, this is Barak Tosun from Gaia Carbon Finance. I'll have a question which is actually quite complementary with many other questions that's been asked here today. It is more to IPCC actually. So we know that climate change is a global issue and we need to fight climate change on a global level. But what happens if each and every nation does not come up with a solution to this issue on a national level? How do we then find this global solution altogether? I mean, you are in this game for a global consensus, and all your actions are on a global level. But don't you think there should be taken some more initiatives on a national level? From, for example, IPCC is taking some initiatives to increase the knowledge about climate change, or things that should be done in order to fight climate change in the right way, with each and every country that still needs to realize that this is the fact and this is something we need to fight against. I mean, how do you see the role of IPCC on the national level in order to find this? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. You know, the IPCC is an intergovernmental body, and therefore we necessarily have to work at the global level. Of course, our assessments go as much into detail as possible on a regional basis. We try to come up with an assessment of the impacts of climate change and mitigation opportunities on a regional basis as well. I think the only response I could give to that question, which I think is a very relevant question, is to see that we do two things. Firstly, we try to disseminate information to every part of the world. And I'll be quite honest, we have not done a good job of that. That's because we just don't have the infrastructure to communicate our findings appropriately. And secondly, I think we also need to work with partners in countries. I mean, a university like this could be a partner, where we provide all the information and then our partner organization packages that information and disseminates it in a country. Because we really don't have the capacity to do that ourselves. We're trying very hard to do that, to sort of work with partners. And I hope this time with the 5th assessment report, we'll do a better job than we have done in the past. So I really think the only way you can get national action is if there's awareness of the national nature of the problem and what can be done to solve it. And this is where I think information dissemination is going to be absolutely crucial.
Are there any other questions from the audience? A very short one. Yes, please.
Yes, hi. You mentioned nuclear. How about these new developments with shale gas, tar? How does that fit in the picture? Thanks.
Yeah, we will be assessing that in the 5th assessment report. As you know, shale gas is relatively new. There really has been too much literature available on it. By the time we finish our report, there will be some literature available, and we'll definitely assess it. I mean, there's no getting away from the fact that as far as greenhouse gas emissions are concerned, excuse me, gas is certainly superior to coal, but we also have to assess some of the local environmental impacts and so on which we will be assessing the literature. So hopefully we'll have much more on some of these subjects in this report than we have had in the last one.
I think that was the last question. Another question from the very back.
Merhaba, Ergün Koç, Enerji ve Tabii Kaynakları Bakanlığı'ndan katıldım toplantıya. Benim öncelikle birkaç açıklamam olacak. Bakanlığımız Yenilenebilir Enerji Genel Müdürlüğü adı altında bir genel müdürlük kuruldu. Son 666 sayılı kararnameyle. Bu bizim yenilenebilir enerjiye olan bakış açımızı bir nevi göstermektedir. İkinci olarak bulunduğumuz genel müdürlük politika yapıcı bir genel müdürlük ve burada çevre dairesi bulunmakta. Ben de oranın bir personeliyim. Bu da bizim bakanlığımızın çevreye karşı olan bir göstergesi. Ben aynı zamanda çevre mühendisiyim kendim de. Burada birçok şey yapıldı, yani konuşma yapıldı bakanlığımızla ilgilendiren. Çünkü ülkemizde bulunan emisyonların %80'i enerji kaynaklı olmakta. Bunda yaklaşık olarak %40 elektrik üretiminden kaynaklanan emisyonlardan kaynaklanmaktadır. Şimdi tabii ki her bakanlığın sitesine girdiğinizde mutlaka ilk karşınıza çıkan şey ülkenindeki vatandaşların refah seviyesini artırmak olarak geçmektedir. Heyecanlıyım, o yüzden biraz sesim titriyor olabilir, kusura bakmayın. Bu yüzden de ülkemizde bizim en çok yaygın olan kaynağımız kömür olarak bulunmakta. Ama bununla beraber yenilenebilir enerji kaynaklarına da mutlaka bir yönelim vardır. Özellikle mesela enerji verimliliği konusunda çok ciddi çalışmalar da yapılmakta. Bu da ayrıyeten bir çalışma olarak değerlendirilebilmekte. Ama ben kendi şahsi fikrim olarak, yani belki kurumumuzu bağlayamayabilir ama gelişmiş olan birçok ülke, Avrupa ülkesi ve Amerika dahil olmak üzere kuruluşlarından bu yana gelişimlerini herhalde çok ciddi manada verimlilik veyahut da yenilenebilir enerjiyle değil, bizim şu anda kullandığımız olan kaynaklarla sağladılar. Yani onların bir tarihsel sorumluluğu var. Yani biz ülkemizi geliştirmek için mecburen...
Sorunuzu alabilir miyiz?
Mecburen bir kaynak kullanmamız gerekiyor. Ve bizim yenilenebilir enerji kaynakları konusunda maalesef teknolojik olarak çok fazla bir altyapımız bulunmamakta. Acaba şöyle bir şey olabilir mi? Yani gelişmiş olan ülkeler bu konuda finansman ve teknoloji destek olarak gelişmekte olan ülkelere yeterince destek sağlarlarsa hem onlar dünyası kirlenmemiş olur, hem de mesela gelişmekte olan ülkeler bu gelişmeyi daha temiz bir şekilde yapabilirler mi? İkinci olarak da bu 2012 yılın Haziran ayında Katar'da bir toplantı yapıldı, Doha'da. Burada 2012 Kyoto protokolü sonrası yine müzakereler devam etti. Fakat Amerika ve Avrupa Birliği herhangi bir şekilde bir indirim veyahut da talebinde bulunmadılar. Herhangi böyle bir indirim şeyinde falan bulunmadılar bir emisyon azaltımı konusunda. Böyle bir ortamda gerçekten hani dünyada siyasi aktörlerin çok ciddi manada bu işe eğilmesi gerekirken bu işten uzak durmaları hani bizim bir nevi politika belirlememizde nasıl bir etki gösterebilir diye soracaktım. Biraz uzun oldu, kusura bakmayın.
Teşekkürler. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to learn that you have a Department of Renewable Energy in the government, and many countries have departments dealing with renewable energy in a number of countries. What we really need is a set of policies by which renewable energy can be supported, and these would involve regulation, these would involve incentives and disincentives. And there are several success stories in other countries where they could have had choices of conventional fuels or fossil fuels, but they decided to go in the direction of renewable energy. And as a result, costs have come down, economies of scale have been achieved. So I think from those case studies, one can easily come up with a clear perception that renewable energy for certain uses is certainly not expensive and would actually be to the benefit of the country's economy. And I think that assessment has to be carried out country by country. It's very difficult to generalize it across the whole globe because resources are different, the resources of renewable energy are different, capabilities are different, the kinds of uses for which energy are used could also differ. So I think my only advice would be that a country like this and any country in the world should first carry out an assessment of the potential of renewable energy and how much of it can be exploited on an economically viable basis. And then I think government can formulate policies by which it moves ahead. And on the question of the developed countries doing more, it is really for this reason that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has this phrase on common but differentiated responsibility. And the word differentiated over there has been put in only because the developed countries historically have emitted much more and have caused this concentration of gases. Also, they have capabilities and technical skills and so on by which they could do much more than developing countries. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I believe there are no further questions from the audience. Dr. Pachauri, this has been a very comprehensive and detailed question and answer session at the end. I would like to thank you on behalf of the Turkish Association for Energy Economics. Here, this is plaque that we have. Sure. Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much.